Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement interview. And today I'm joined by Antonio Humphreys. Antonio is Senior Manager of Global Procurement at Adobe Systems, based here in California. And I've actually seen Antonio speak before. He's always been high on my list of practitioners that I wanted to interview, and so I'm delighted that we're actually able to make it happen today. We were connected by the team at ProcureCon, as Antonio will be speaking at the upcoming ProcureCon Marketing conference in New Orleans at the end of November. And Antonio's enjoyed a career that, after an internship with NASA, actually started in sales before he jumped over to the other side of the table and joined us here in procurement. He's worked for organizations such as Shell, Hewlett-Packard, and Gap before joining Adobe. And Antonio has a really deep background in both procurement organizational design and development and in the marketing category. And it's those two topics that were the focus of our conversation today. And so I started by asking Antonio, after tasting both the sales and procurement side of the table, what is it that actually keeps him in procurement?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you look at the way that I think our function has evolved here, I think we've really come from, just buying widgets, and when you look at like your typical supply chain, and there's lots of stuff that I've done early in my career, kind of in that space. But I think the fact that it's gotten a lot more complex in terms of what we do end to end, it's not really just about buying things. I think it's really about being true consultants to the business, right? And that's the part that I really like about my job, and I think just the function overall. And I think there's still a long roadway, for us to kind of grow and evolve. When you're seeing where technology is going, and I think there's a lot that we can incorporate into our own tool belt, and make sure that we're, using that to the best of our ability to be the right stewards to the business.
Yeah, I guess also help the business integrate that into their kind of operations or what they buy, because some of these, the technologies that are coming down the pipe that are providing opportunities for transformation are actually coming from the outside supply market. So we can influence and impact that too, even if it's not in procurement itself.
Most definitely. I mean, there are so many examples of, when you look at all the different industry verticals and the different types of technology, whether it is specific to, a particular vertical or just across the board, right? And there's lots of things that, obviously if we're talking about RPA and AI and MI, and there's a lot of that can be applicable across the board. And I think a lot of those things that we're doing within Adobe, but I think are applicable to pretty much any company across the board that's willing to make that investment.
So I have to ask, when I was looking into your background, I noticed, I think it was the very beginning of your career, you were with NASA and you were buying services for the space shuttle program. So I was intrigued to know what the difference is when you're buying something for a space shuttle, versus the kind of services that we typically buy, that you may be buying today.
Yeah, it was an awesome experience. So I worked at Johnson Space Center, for NASA in Houston. And when we look at that, it's just a great opportunity to work with literally the astronauts and a lot of the technical engineers that were, responsible for the space shuttle program and for the ISS, the International Space Station. So I had a chance to work with all of those folks and even with the Russian Space Projects Office, because there was a lot of work that was being done, between NASA and the Russian agency. So when you look at it, a lot of parallels, right? I mean, those are basically just your business partners, your stakeholders, and, you're really looking at the requirements of, what's needed, for your product. So whether it's the space shuttle or it's, computer hardware, or if it's, jeans, from Gap, or, cloud software that you're supporting, within Adobe, it's all comparable, right? You're supporting the business in the right way to get the best, reliable products and services to really kind of drive the results. But just an awesome opportunity just really early on in my career.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think sometimes it can, when you're buying the same, I don't know, you might be buying the same thing, but across a different industry, or you're working in a different industry. But when you get the opportunity to work on such fascinating projects like that, it just kind of steps it up a gear, doesn't it? In terms of maybe even the motivation or the excitement to go to work in the morning, because you're working on something that's just a little bit different.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the culture at NASA and kind of the energy, especially at the time when when the shuttle program was still really, really vibrant, there was, the true ups and downs, right? You look at, a couple of the explosions that happened and, just the incredible sadness and, just the downturn of what happened there. But then just on the opposite side, just the massive elation of just really successful missions. And that's what we were driven to, as a whole, as a collective whole. We were all one team, right, to make sure that shuttle mission was successful and making sure those astronauts got up and came back in a safe way.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely really exciting and motivating.
Kind of the power of a collective goal.
You name it, right? I mean, any goal to kind of make that mission, and there were literally like thousands of moving parts, millions. I mean, there's just so many elements of it, but my part that I could help contribute to, I think that's just the mindset, right? And the culture was just, whether you were in procurement or, you were an astronaut, you're flight control, or if you're engineers, that were helping in testing and training, and, the Johnson Space Center as a whole is just massive. And when you look at how they partner with a lot of the other sites around the States, it's a pretty impressive operation.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you're a pretty proactive member of the procurement community. I know that's how we've got to know each other. I know that we're both going to some of the similar events that are coming up. We were just chatting about that off mic. I'm interested why you invest your time in the procurement community itself, and what kind of value do you get out of doing it?
I think it's a couple of things. When you look at the investment, there's a big part of, I think, our community as a whole where we find a lot of value in just kind of benchmarking and having good, honest conversations, right? And I think a lot of the industry forums are a good place for that. So whether it's, SIG and ProcureCon and procurement leaders, or Silicon Valley sourcing leaders, A&A, you name it. There's a ton of different organizations out there that we use as kind of like that platform. But I think what's important is just really having those good, honest conversations of, hey, how are you doing it? And by the way, what are you doing to, quantify, different metrics and or savings or value, or, what's the latest and greatest that you're trying to drive innovation, within your procurement or sourcing organization. To me, that's the real value. You can hear lots of good case studies and, there are different presentations from lots of folks, what I think is really valuable. But then I also think just having those good, solid, relations with folks in the industry where you can truly be a community and help each other out and provide those insights, I think that's super important. And that's why, to be honest, I stay really involved, because I think we need to support each other, right? Because I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, but then also just kind of support each other to grow and be successful in all of our organizations. Yeah,
it's really interesting you say that, because I couldn't agree more. It's incumbent upon all of us within the community, I feel, to help move the function, the profession, whatever we want to call it, but to move it forward, to address the challenges that we're going to face, but also to help each other take advantage of the opportunities. Because I don't really see each other as competing. Even if we're in organizations that may compete against each other, I see us more as a collective community who are all passionate about the same thing and want the same results ultimately within the companies we work.
Couldn't agree more. There's a presentation I did for SIG a few years ago that kind of talked about the historical perspective of like sourcing, the sourcing system, early on in the 1700s. It's really called the putting out system. And that was really about, how folks really started looking at procuring and distributing raw materials and, things like that. And then really kind of evolved to the first and second industrial revolutions and, kind of looking at how that impacted that same type of supply chain, impact in business creation. Yeah. And really, when you looked at supply chain management as a whole, really kind of came about in the 80s, right? And then strategic sourcing as a discipline more in the 90s. And then now that we're in, obviously, the 2000s, this is like our big opportunity to kind of redefine, right? Where do we take it from here, right? Because I think we have a mix of all of those elements, right? We have supply chain, we have sourcing, there's end-to-end procure to pay, But what do we go from there, right? And I think there's a lot that we look at, again, from the consulting side and risk mitigation and change management and process improvement. There's so many hats that we wear that I think we have the opportunity to mold and create our function in a much better way, even moving forward.
Yeah, so if you look then into your crystal ball, what do you think the future of procurement looks like? Or what do you think is achievable and attainable, if we put our collective minds to it?
Yeah, I think when you think about just what's next, I think there's a lot that's still going to be focused on, BPO, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of conversations around nearshore, offshore as companies continue to grow, either from, if you're here at stateside or, if you're just in a single country or a single region. There's a lot of companies that are just scaling and growing, at a pretty fast pace, right? Yeah. So you really need to think about what are the things that we need to do collectively to kind of meet those challenges head on, and how do we address that? And I know that's one of the things that we're looking at here at Adobe as well is, just how do we continue to look for efficiencies and scale in the right way. Yeah. And I think that's a big one. And there's a lot of things, obviously, that's in the industry around robotic process automation and AI, and those are things likewise that we're doing lots of case studies internally as well, and kind of proof of concepts just to kind of test how that can potentially drive, particular efficiencies, in Adobe. And I know there's lots of other players that have been doing that successfully for years now. And there's lots of others that still are kind of testing that. So I think when you look at a combination of those things, it really is, how do you scale your organization in the right way to support, growing functions? And on the other side of it is, if there are, you're hitting a little bit more cost constraints and that type of thing, you still need to figure out, from an org perspective, how are you still managing, that headcount in the best way possible and still trying to balance cost and efficiency.
Yeah. Do you see that, our focus changes to where you invest those dollars in terms of headcount or resource? And maybe this is as technology becomes more mature in taking away some of the more tactical and transactional activities. Do you see as shifting focus to the investment on essentially what we'd consider a lot more strategic, commercially focused, perhaps doing a better job of putting our money on impacting business outcomes and solving challenges as opposed to maybe what we're doing today?
Yeah, I think that's just going to be a natural evolution, right? And it's kind of the nirvana of what we talked about, of not really focusing as much on some of the lower complexity, lower dollar, type deals, spend activity, and really going in for the much bigger, strategic, overarching, deals that are driving the biggest impact. And that's, to me, the nirvana is when you have earned a seat at the table on those big deals. Yeah. That's where you're basically part of the larger collective team, right? You're not just the procurement person. Yeah. You're part of that core team that's really driving that critical, business decision, right, to take it to the next level.
Yeah, you're a commercial manager, not a procurement manager.
Most definitely.
Do you think that changes the kind of roles that we hire for within procurement, or maybe the skill sets that we hire for?
I do. And when you look at, skill sets, I think you can look at it in lots of ways. A lot of people are going to say, hey, you know what? I want somebody that has a good, solid, foundational, supply chain / sourcing / procurement, background, right, or degree. Others are going to say, you know what, I already have a good mix of that, within my team. I want, folks that have a good sales background or a good engineering background or a good HR background, right, to kind of mix things up. And I like that approach because it kind of gives you the best of both worlds, right, where you've got folks that come in with other areas of expertise that they can leverage, and you can always teach folks and ramp them up on, the sourcing side of things. If you're teaching about RFXs and supplier management and those types of things. But those other kind of real critical skill sets are so important, just for success. And one of the things that we really, really hone in on here at Adobe, and I know I've spoken with others too, is really around EQ, right? Emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
That's the big part of showing up, really being able to understand your audience, figure out the right way to address, that audience, the right way to show up, the right way to listen, and the right way to respond, right? So I think a lot of it is that assessment, being able to adjust your approach, to that audience, because we're basically supporting lots of different personalities, lots of different parts of the business. It could be an engineer, it could be a marketing person, it could be an HR person. So that's the part that's critical, is we need folks that are going to be able to, adjust and change in the right way.
How do you measure, and this is something I've always wondered, how do you measure for that EQ? Are there certain things you look for in somebody's background, for example, or is it more viewing how they interact, viewing how they build relationships, viewing how how they work in situations of conflict? Or I'm interested how you look about really figuring out if somebody has that EQ that you think is necessary.
Yeah, I think you can get a sense of that when you're looking at somebody's, CV or resume, right? You can look at how they comment on the way they've supported different activities, projects, roles. So that's like one thing, like on paper. But two, when you're talking to somebody for the first time, that part of what we do is we focus on a lot of questions that really just kind of hone in somebody's approach, right? So you kind of give them a typical scenario, and you kind of work them through a case study, to see either if they have done this before, really kind of explain how they approached it, or, just say, based on your, how have you done this? And that's like a second way, just more of kind of like an informational type interview piece. But then really when, somebody's coming in for the first time, if they're new to your organization, you want to really kind of hone in and focus their development in that area pretty quickly, right? And if they're just outstanding at it, great. Let them run, let them do what they know best and produce those results. But, and if they need a little bit of help, it's all good, right? It's all about helping them provide, you help them to provide, development skills, in that area, because in the end, that is one of the most critical soft skills, right, that you need, that's going to help drive good, solid business relationships and ultimately drive those results.
Yeah, one of the things I've always been interested in, and I think I ask this of a number of different guests, but I'm really interested in your perspective, is as we evolve and as the function kind of changes and we take advantage of some of the opportunities in front of us, obviously we need to evolve our metrics at the same time, because that's, I think, one of the biggest difficulties or challenges we have in trying to demonstrate the value that we can create over and above cost savings. I'm interested in what you feel in terms of what metrics become important in the future as we do change, and then perhaps how can we convince others that those are measures of which to look at the value we create versus how they may be used to actually measuring us.
Sure. There's a lot that, I think we've partnered with like CEB in the past, looking at some of their, specific functional metrics that we looked at early on. And some of those are around functional cost, spend per procurement FTE. So basically spend per headcount, spend coverage, cost per FTE, savings per FTE. So just some of those, more kind of quantitative metrics that are kind of basis around cost. So I think that's one way that you can kind of look at those, those types of metrics. But on the other side, there's your typical savings and value, and we've talked about that for years. But what we're really evolving is, and as companies are scaling, it's much more beyond that, right? There's this hole to fill around risk mitigation and compliance, and proper due diligence on your supply qualifications, legal reviews. So I think there's this kind of blending, right? When we do in procurement, we're almost compliance, internal audit, legal, finance, all in one, right? So there's a lot that we do to wear all of those hats. So that's why I say, like, if we're really that true kind of consulting arm, we have the ability to wear those hats, and that's where I think our true value add is. And if we're thinking about the metrics that kind of, we should be measured on, it should be a mix of how we're supporting the business in each of those ways, to really address each of those kind of value add pieces.
Yeah. And how those tie into the objectives, the metrics that, at a category level our stakeholders may have, but also at an organizational level, what are the 3, 4, 5 pillars, whatever it may be, from an org strategy that we're measuring? How do we actually tie into those? Because often what we measure, and, obviously I'm thinking about cost savings, doesn't even tie into any great organizational metric. And then we wonder, how come we don't necessarily get involved at the level we want to get involved, because we're not actually directly connected with ultimately the corporate strategy.
So it's a great point, right? And I think you're basically referencing maybe like inter-department goals, right? That you may not be, kind of communicating to the rest of your stakeholders. But when you look at those goals, and I'll give you one example. So I partner with our corporate marketing organization and with our CMO, and it's my job to make sure that I understand her and her team's, business objectives and just critical goals and for the year. And my job really should be to align, to all of her goals and objectives to make sure that we're knocking those out of the park.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, that's number one, is I want to make sure that we're supporting them in the best way to help achieve all of our, organizational goals as a whole as Adobe. And then after that, it's like, okay, now what do we measure specifically within our department, that we can say, how are we measuring up to best in class in all these different areas? So, spot on.
Yeah. You mentioned marketing there. I actually have some questions that I want to touch on for the marketing category specifically, but let me just touch first on, something that we can do in procurement to market ourselves better, and that's to think about our procurement brand. I wondered your perspective on, is the brand procurement and having a brand around procurement actually that important? Does it really make a difference within an organization of how we're perceived?
So I definitely do.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of what we, have focused on in our leadership team to really think about what do we do to, really develop our own, I'll just call it a sub-brand, right?
Yeah.
If we're thinking about global procure to pay. There's a lot that, to be honest, some people are going to say, I just don't know anything about you, right? Or some people are like, well, I know about you, but, I have these reservations, or I know about you and you guys are the greatest, right? You're going to have this widespread kind of view of lots of different personalities and perspectives, but I think there's still that huge opportunity to really brand yourself and kind of educate your stakeholders in a way to say, in a simple message, hey, this is what we do, end to end. These are all the things that we can support you with. And these are all the tools, that we can help to get you there. Right. So I think that it is a huge opportunity. And I've seen some really good examples of that in the industry where folks have, produced, really nice marketing materials around it. They've done, lots of things around web content. And I think that's where we are. We've developed a lot of stuff in-house, that's just good, solid web content, lots of things around, ways for folks to contact us accordingly. And we're definitely in kind of like that 2.0 phase where we want to get to that next level of education and making sure folks understand, really what we do to support the business and kind of drive that forward. Yeah.
Are you able to work with your marketing group to actually do that? Because that's one thing I always recommend to folks is take advantage of the resources that you have within your own organization. Don't feel like you got to do this on your own and come up with some fantastic marketing branding strategy. You actually have experts in the company who can help you do that because that's what they do for a living.
Couldn't agree more. And to echo that point, so we are working with our internal PR and communications team because I brought this up to our VP of internal communications, and she owns PR for the company. And she said, most definitely, just leverage her team, in anything that we can do to kind of drive that forward. So we've really focused on, kind of getting our basis around web content, but we really want to then, take it to the next level around what we really want to emphasize around just being our trusted partner, right, to the business and where we go from there.
Yeah. No, that's great to hear that you're able to lever that group, because I just see it so rarely. And yet it's something that, and I think when I was on the practitioner side, I never really thought about it. But now I have thought about it. It seems like a no-brainer. And, our internal teams usually are like they have open arms. They want to help us.
It's all about, prioritization, and if you can get it on their radar, with 100 other projects that's going on, it's all good, right? And just kind of stress the importance and what it can drive for the business, and I think you'll get their attention.
Yeah, and it'll probably help you build a stronger relationship with the marketing group too, because they see that you're trying to act in perhaps a different way than what they perceived you before you started working with them.
Most definitely. And then I was literally on a call right before our conversation here, and some of the feedback, it was almost just what I just mentioned, right? One person knows us really well. The other person was kind of so-so, and the other person, just didn't have really much idea at all, right? Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like those three perspectives, and they're like, yeah, we need to solve this.
Yes. Well, I want to finish on a couple of marketing-related questions, because as we've mentioned a couple of times, it's an area of specialty for you. And we've talked about some of the challenges facing procurement, but I think that, and maybe sometimes we forget this again too, is that most of our stakeholders face similar challenges. What's on the minds of the CMO today? What keeps the CMO up at night right now?
I think when you look at the pressures, right, the pressure obviously on top line to really drive and support that revenue for all the different business units and product lines that any company's kind of working on. So that's just obviously number one, part and parcel.
Yeah,
I think when you look at there's a lot around MRM and just return on marketing investment, right? Like that kind of ROMI model. Mm-hmm. That part is just always huge, because there's always that challenge of you have X amount of dollars where you need to really kind of prove, right? You need to really prove the return on that investment in all of those critical areas, whether it be advertising or production or media investments or different research projects or investment in events and sponsorships, right? There's so many facets to kind of the marketing and sales space that ROMI model is just incredibly important. So I think it's just that continual pressure to prove, what sort of return are we getting? And then I think beyond that, there's a lot in the industry right now. I know the ANA has done a great job of highlighting, some of these things. There's different industry issues around, just how are things kind of operating with the agency model? Mm-hmm. There's different things that are happening there. There's different things around, program buying. So there's going to be continued, I think, scrutiny and kind of focus on, how has this business been operating in the past and how does it truly evolve moving forward? And I think the changing agency landscape and how that's managed, and then, the workflow from there to this model of buying, with the kind of the third-party media properties, and how is that going to change with, your typical traditional to digital? And obviously that's just been lightning quick in terms of that transition. So that's going to be, I think, how do you understand and manage that in the best way? That's probably one of the bigger challenges.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier a ROI model, which was just something I wasn't familiar with within marketing, and it was something that piqued my interest. I wonder if you could share just a little bit more about how marketers generally will measure the ROI of their investment, because I think that understanding that for folks who may not have the background in marketing that you do is just so insightful and really helps, kind of make a connection with your marketing colleagues and understand what it is that they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so it's basic when you look at some of your ROI calculations just from a basic financial perspective. So you're going to look at that, I think, when you're assessing any of your general OpEx lines, right, from the P&L. So you can look at that from one line, but then when you start breaking down the marketing specific items, you're going to look at, similar to like what I mentioned, some of the procurement quantitative metrics, right? So you can look at that from a headcount perspective, just in terms of functional costs, but then you're really looking at kind of the breakdown of different advertising campaign investments, or broad market research efforts, or huge industry events, where you're trying to bring in 10,000 plus paying attendees, to kind of educate around product portfolios and launches and things like that. So all of those come with their own level of complexity and obviously big spend. So I think from there, what the teams usually do is they really try and gauge, what are some of the basic metrics, right, of, the amount of attendees or CPMs, right, if it's tied to media, or whatever the quantitative measure on kind of measuring that basis against the initial investment. That's the part where, you could come up with a specific baseline by just kind of dividing those two. But beyond that, you're really trying to think long-term, right? Short-term, we are able to get this, but long-term, what is this really driving? And ultimately, that's what you're trying to do is both get that win in the short term by kind of doing that analysis. But ultimately, if you're making that investment, how are you thinking that that's going to impact the long term from a revenue, margin, profit perspective? That's the nirvana.
Right. Kind of how's it play into a bigger strategy, a longer term strategy?
Most definitely.
And my last question today is, I think that you've been pretty successful in the marketing category, and it's often a difficult thing to do, and it really is based on the power of building relationships, not being a traditional procurement, kind of taking a traditional procurement mindset. But I just love to hear, maybe some of the tricks or the tips that you could share to really help become a trusted advisor and a consultant to the marketing function, especially when I'm thinking more of those creative categories.
Totally. Yeah. I think the biggest thing is, just show up as knowledgeable as you can, about the marketing space, right? Be knowledgeable about what's going on in the industry. Know a bit about, what's shifting, right? What are the changes? What are the things that are impacting? Because the more you show up as either on par as much as you can with your stakeholders, or even above, right? So if you're just more on top of a couple things that you can actually then educate them on, that's going to be just a huge win, because they're going to be like, well, yeah, this guy or gal isn't just, aware of buying hardware, right? Or, doing something in HR. They are true knowledge, experts in what's going on in marketing and advertising, et cetera. So I think that's one. Two, I think it's just really showing up and listening, right? Just don't go in that you're going to say, well, this is our process, this is our policy, and this is what we expect, in order to work together. That's not it, right? That's obviously on the back end of how you want to make sure that you're using those things, but you really want to listen to them first, right? Listen to what their pain points are. Listen to what pressures they're under, right? What are their hot buttons? What are the things that, if you're truly understanding their business, figure out a way that you can complement that team, right? Figure out a way that you can support in the right way and use your own tools maybe they don't have access to.
Right.
And whether it's providing the right level of data and analytics, whether it's jumping in on, strategic negotiations, whether it's helping in an agency business review where, there could be a potential issue, right, that you can help mediate. There are a ton of things that you can do if you just help listen and be part of that constructive dialogue to help, solve their issues. I think that's the biggest piece. Okay.
Well, Antonio, I really thank you for your time today. I have one last question, which is, I think the easy one. And that's, if listeners are interested in following up, in connecting with you, in touching base with you, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, sure. So you can definitely just find me on LinkedIn. I mean, that's pretty much the standard. So you can find me out there at Antonio Humphreys. Likewise, if you want to contact me via email, it's AHUMPHRE@adobe.com. Be happy to talk with you and, again, build that community and benchmark and have a good conversation.
Well, great. Well, what I'll do, Antonio, is I'll include those links in our show notes. So those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/Adobe. That's artofprocurement.com/Adobe. And one last time, I just really thank you for joining us today and for sharing some of your insights and your experiences with the Art of Procurement listeners.
Outstanding. Philip, it was a pleasure. Thank you for your time, and I hope everybody found this a little bit useful.
Yep. Thanks, Antonio. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.